welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Biographical Encyclopedia, Volume 1, and this article is entitled Smith, George Albert. This might be easy to think, oh, it's about George Albert Smith. Nope, it's not. It's about George A. Smith. Now, George A. Smith was the first cousin of Joseph Smith Jr. So Joseph Smith Jr.'s father was Joseph Smith Sr., yeah? And his brother, Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother, named John Smith, he was one of the early patriarchs of the church. He wasn't the first, Joseph Smith Sr. was, but John Smith was, he's also called Uncle John, was the uncle of Joseph Smith Jr., brother of Joseph Smith Sr., and he had a son named George Albert, and they called him George A. I'm not sure why they called him that, actually. Come to think of it, you'd think they'd just call him George, but I guess George A. was what they called him. Anyways, because I understood that they really did call him that, as if that were his name, like, you know, walking down the street, hey, George A., you know? But yeah, this is the first cousin of Joseph Smith Jr. And so I know a little bit about him. He was a few years younger, a good handful of years younger than Joseph Smith. I think he was like 15 or something like that when he was baptized. And then he was called as one of the 12. And I think that was right around the time of the Exodus. I want to say it was either the very tail end of the Nauvoo period or right after they left. It was one of those. And he was still fairly young, called as one of the 12. And then he moved west with Brigham Young. He was called into the first presidency after Willard Richards passed away, I believe. And he was one of the first presidency for quite a while. He was also church historian, I believe. And he was the trustee in trust at one point. And I remember this one. It was really kind of cool because Brigham Young decided that some of the day-to-day things about being president of the church was getting him down. It was kind of too much to do. So he asked George A. Smith to take over for him a couple of different things, and he agreed. And then when he went to sustain him in front of the congregation at General Conference, they protested. He said, I'm asking if it's all right with everybody if I ask George A. Smith to take over some of my job as trustee in trust. And people stood up and said, no, it was a real protest. I'm going to see if I can find it. It was really interesting, sometime in the 1860s. And for about 6 months, then it was delayed because the people did not want to accept that. But it really goes to show how very, very beloved Brigham Young was. So anyways, I think you would know him probably better by his children and grandchildren. He had a son named John Henry Smith, who was also an apostle, and he had a grandson named George Albert Smith, who became president of the church, which is who most people think of when they think of George Albert Smith. Yeah, but he was actually named after his grandfather. So they shared a name, but they actually didn't really look much alike. It's interesting how quickly genetics can, splice off from the branch. I mean, obviously they don't have a lot of genetic material together, but they were related. So it's a little interesting because George A. Smith was kind of like a heavy built man. George Albert Smith was thin as a rail. So, it's also interesting because George Albert Smith then had a son named George Albert Jr., and he had a son named George Albert Smith III. But the thing about that is they sometimes call him the fifth because they're including George A. in that lineup, but they had somebody in between not named George Albert. That was John Henry Smith. So, they're not all the same. I already have a video up on John Henry Smith and on George Albert Smith. If you're interested, you can look back at those. But yeah, like George A. Smith, I hadn't talked about yet because he died so early on. He died in the 1860s, I want to say. 1868, something like that. And Brigham Young went on to live another 10 years. So he died in 1877. So I think that's right. I might get the date wrong of his death. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm not as confident. I mean, it could have been 1872. It was around there, late 60s, early 70s. Anyways, yeah, I'm excited about this. And George A. Smith, amazing person. I already know a little bit about him, as I've mentioned. But I don't have all of the details and timelines straight in my head. And I'm sure we'll learn a few tidbits that I didn't know. So let's take a look at the article. Smith, George Albert, first counselor to President Brigham Young from 1868 to 1875. Okay, that's when he died. Okay, 1868 was when he was called in the first presidency then. All right, my bad. Was the son of patriarch John Smith and Clarissa Lyman, and a cousin to Joseph the Prophet. He was born June 26, 1817, yeah? And Joseph was born in 1805. So that is why there's such a age disparity, 12 years between them. In Pottstown, St. Lawrence County, New York, and was trained strictly in the religion of the Congregational Church, of which his father and mother were members, until he was 15 years of age, as I said, 15. While living on a farm on Racket River and attending school in the village of Potsdam, George A. grew very rapidly, attaining his full growth several years before he became of age. That's not that uncommon, yeah? So he hit puberty early. This gave him an awkward address as of an overgrown boy, and as children growing fast are usually weak, it was so with him. I'm not sure I would have said that, but okay. In addition to these misfortunes for a schoolboy, he was nearsighted, and being contented with his studies, the society of older people, and the companionship of his own thoughts, he paid little attention to cultivating the goodwill and currying favor with the boys at school. Interesting. The consequence was that they made fun of him, bullied him more or less, and at one time, shortly after a period of illness, carried their fun to such an extreme that George A. resolved on retaliation. But, knowing his weakness at the time, he refrained attempting his revenge then, and harbored strength until a favorable opportunity should be presented. The time came, and it developed a phase of his character which was new to his schoolmates, but distinguished him then and ever after. His sensitive nature had been repeatedly outraged. He felt that he had been abused by his schoolmates, and that they had taken advantage of him unfairly, and that the insult to his honor and manhood demanded reparation. If any of the boys were not guilty of this general arraignment, he did not stop to discriminate in their favor. He felt that they were all down on him, and he determined to whip the school, and he succeeded. He started in and kept at it until he had whipped every boy of his size and age. They never made fun of him after that. I don't like that at all. So he went around and got in a fight with everybody, and they agreed to just take him on one-on-one? Because that's the only way he could have won, and that's assuming he was a decent fighter. But he said that he wasn't a good fighter, and so, I don't know, that surprises me. Why would he choose that tactic? I mean, obviously there are some people you can't communicate with, unless it's physically, but I don't know, that just seems really strange to me. In the winter of 1828, Father John Smith received a letter from his nephew Joseph, who then lived in western New York, in which a very striking prediction occurred, foretelling awful judgments upon the present generation because of wickedness and unbelief. The letter made a deep impression upon the mind of George A., who, but a boy of 11 years, was capable of appreciating the statements it contained, which he treasured in his memory. His father observed on reading them, "Joseph writes like a prophet." In August 1830, the father of the prophet and his brother Don Carlos visited their relatives in Potsdam and vicinity. They brought with them a copy of the Book of Mormon, which they left with George A.'s father, while they went on a visit to Father Asahel Smith and family. During their absence, George A. and his mother read a great deal in the strange new book, or Golden Bible, as it was popularly called. The neighbors, who often came in and heard portions of it read, ridiculed it and offered many objections to its contents. These young George A. soon found himself trying to answer, and although he professed no belief in the book himself, having in fact noted many serious objections to it, he was so successful in refuting the charges the neighbors brought against it that they generally turned from the argument discomfited, with the observation to his mother that her boy was a little too smart for them. When his uncle and Don Carlos returned, George A. laid before them his objections, which he believed to be unanswerable. His uncle took them up carefully, quoted the scriptures upon the subject, showed the reasonableness of the record, and was so successful as to entirely remove every objection, and to convince him that it was just what it purported to be. George A. from that time ever after advocated the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. He was also convinced of the necessity of religion, and not being sufficiently instructed by his relatives how to obtain it, after they had left, he attended a protracted series of congregational revival meetings. These lasted 17 days and effected the conversion of every sinner in Potsdam who attended them, except George A., who went to the meeting regularly, sat in the gallery listening attentively, but waited in vain for the sensation of religion which should bring him down to the anxious bench. Finally, prayers and exhortations having failed, the minister, Reverend Frederick E. Cannon, pronounced him reprobate, and sealed him up unto eternal damnation, saying, "Thy blood be upon thine own head." Wow! 9 times he thus delivered this inoffensive but unsatisfied seeker for religion to the buffetings of Satan and the burning of an endless hell. Gosh. That's weird. It's also strange that, like, the family didn't mention, hey, you know, Joseph just started up a church. If you're interested in being baptized into it, you can come down. You know, I don't know. It just seems strange that they didn't invite them to do that. They just left them the Book of Mormon. I guess they didn't want to seem pushy, and they were family. But, But then, like, leaving George A. to just go and figure it out for himself, I think that's a little strange, that's all. Anyways, here's a picture. George A. Smith. This is a really terrible picture. You can barely make out any features, except that he was bald. Like, I don't know, kind of broad-shouldered. That's all I got from this picture. You can't even tell if he had hair at all. That's so weird. Anyways, I don't understand this priest either, being like damning you to eternity. Like, gee, thanks. I really appreciate that you think I have no hope. Like, that's weird to me. Like, who does that? Weird. For 2 years, George A. had performed the greater part of the labor on his father's farm, but in the winter of 1832-3 he attended school and gave considerable attention to studying the gospel and its requirements. He was baptized by Joseph H. Wakefield, September 10, 1832. In May 1833, he started with his parents to Kirtland, Ohio, and they arrived there on the 25th of that month, and were warmly welcomed by the prophet Joseph Smith and by the saints who had gathered there, numbering about 500. Immediately on reaching Kirtland, George A. became interested in the affairs of the church, and was delighted with his cousin the prophet, whom he had never seen before. Okay, yeah, I mean, that is possible. It's also really difficult to travel back then. He was on hand for any duty required, and spent many nights guarding the houses of the brethren who were in much danger from the mobs. During the summer and fall, he was engaged in quarrying and hauling rock for the Kirtland Temple, attending masons and performing other labor about the walls. The first 2 loads of rock taken to the temple ground were hauled from Stannard's quarry by George A. and Harvey Stanley. In May 1834, George A. started from Kirtland with Zion's Camp for the state of Missouri. He was one of the youngest ones in the group, I believe, and returned again to Kirtland in the summer, walking on foot 2,000 miles. He was ordained to 70 March 1st, 1835, under the hands of Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph Smith Jr., and Sidney Rigdon, the latter being spokesman. He was the junior member of the first quorum of the 70. On the 30th of the following May, he was appointed to a mission to preach the gospel in the East. Elder Lyman Smith, a second cousin and member of the same quorum, was his traveling companion. They started June 5th, 1835, traveled on foot about 2,000 miles, without person scrip, held about 80 meetings in the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, baptized 8, and returned to Kirtland, where George A. arrived October 5th. In the spring of 1836, he received his endowments in the Kirtland Temple, after which he performed a mission in Ohio, traveling on foot about 1,200 miles. In the spring of 1837, he commenced a mission in Ohio and Virginia, which continued about 1 year. On this mission, he traveled about 2,500 miles, nearly half of his journeyings on foot. In 1838, he emigrated with his father's family to Daviess County, Missouri, where he was ordained a high counselor, June 28, 1838. Wow, he went on a lot of missions, yeah? Traveling some 800 miles on foot and about 700 by water, including the return journey. After his return, he removed his father's family to Illinois. In 1839, he removed far west in Missouri. On the morning of April 26, 1839, he was ordained one of the 12 apostles, tail end of Nauvoo period, on the southeast cornerstone of the intended temple at Far West. He returned to Illinois, whence he started for England on a mission in September and arrived in Liverpool April 6, 1840. Wasn't that the same time as Brigham Young? Oh, I could be wrong. Not sure. He labored for over 1 year with much success and returned to Nauvoo, Illinois, where he arrived July 5, 1841. On the 25th of the same month, he married Bathsheba W. Bigler, who is still alive. Well, at the time of writing, which is kind of crazy considering it was 1901 when this was written. In the fall of 1842, he preached in the principal places in Illinois and returned to Nauvoo November 4th. In the summer and fall of 1843, he traveled about 6,000 miles, preaching in the middle and eastern states. In the spring of 1844, he attended conferences and preached in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, and was in the last named state when he heard of the death of the prophet and patriarch of the church. He immediately returned to Nauvoo and took an active part in the councils and deliberations consequent upon that sad event. He was elected quartermaster of the Nauvoo Legion September 17, 1844, was also elected a trustee of the Nauvoo House Association, and labored actively in forwarding the erection of that building. He continued these labors until the mob commenced its outrages upon the saints in the fall of 1845, from which period he was active in the counseling, fervent in his labors on the temple, and diligent in making preparations for the exodus of the saints from Nauvoo. Before leaving the temple of Nauvoo, writes George A., my wife, under the law of Abraham and Sarah, gave me 5 wives. Wow. He let his wife choose his other wives? That's kind of cool, actually. Viz. Lucy Smith, born February 9, 1817, at Newry, Maine. Nancy Clement, born October 31, 1815, at Dryden, Tompkins County, New York. Zilpha Stark, born July 3, 1818, at Heartland, Niagara County, New York. Sarah Ann Libby, born May 7, 1818, at Ossipee, Stratford County, New Hampshire. And Hannah Maria Libby, born June 29, 1828, at Ossipee, Stratford County, New Hampshire. He also married Susan E. West after he reached Great Salt Lake Valley. 5 of Brother George A.'s wives survived him. They bore unto him 20 children, 11 of whom, among them Apostle John Henry Smith, are yet living. Early in February, he crossed the Mississippi River with his family on his way to find an asylum in the far west from the rage of mobs and the persecution of bigoted professors of religion. The ensuing winter, he tarried with the main camp at winter quarters. While there, the people suffered severely from scurvy, a disease induced through the lack of vegetable diet. Isn't it low vitamin C that causes scurvy? George A.'s 3rd wife and 4 children died of this disease. Wow, really? 4 children? Oh my gosh, that's 5 people. Wow. He visited all the camps and urged the cultivation of the potato as a cure for the scurvy, but little seed could be obtained. What was, however, produced in a marvelous manner. As they had no vegetables for 1 year, their bread was mostly made of corn, bought 200 miles away in Missouri. The season after George A. had left Pottawatomie County, the potato crop was a failure, and the saying went forth that it was because George A., the potato saint, had gone to the mountains. Okay, that's a weird thing to say, but do potatoes cure scurvy, though? I mean, can you get vitamin C from potatoes? I'm going to have to look that up, but that's crazy. Wow, scurvy, of all things. Like, I wouldn't have thought scurvy would be, like, their main problem, but I guess it was. In 1847, he accompanied President Young and the company of pioneers in searching out and making the road to and finding the location of the church in the Great Basin. During this journey, he walked 1,700 miles and rode, mostly on horseback, 800, much of the distance with rawhide soles on his shoes. He was 6 weeks without bread, though he was better off than most of the pioneer company, for he had about 25 pounds of flour locked up in his trunk, unknown to anyone. Then why didn't he make some bread? Weirdo. He lived as the rest on buffalo bulls and other wild meat, which was not always plentiful. He issued his reserved flour by cupfuls to the sick, some of whom attribute to this circumstance the preservation of their lives. Maybe. Wow. He planted the first potato that was put in the ground in Salt Lake Valley and built a house for his father in the fort before starting on his return to winter quarters, where he arrived October 31st of the same year. In 1848, he removed to the neighborhood of Canesville and opened a farm. In 1849, he took charge of the immigration in Council Bluffs, organizing and starting the companies. With the last of these, he started westward with his family, July 4th, 1849. Yeah, that's interesting because Canesville is in Iowa, is it not? And so it's interesting that he he went to Salt Lake, he planted some plants, and then he went back to winter quarters. And he stayed there for a couple of years, is what I'm hearing. Their teams were heavy laden, and they encountered hail and rainstorms. Their cattle also stampeded, and at the South Pass they were overtaken by a heavy storm in which 70 animals were frozen. They made their journey to Great Salt Lake City, 1,034 miles in 155 days, arriving October 27th. George A. was elected a member of the Senate of the Provisional State of Deseret and reported a bill for the organization of the judiciary, which was the first bill printed for the consideration of members. He also reported a bill in relation to the construction of the National Railway across the continent. In December 1850, he raised a company of 118 volunteers, accompanied by about 30 families, and started for the purpose of planting a colony near the Great Salt Lake. The day after they started, the thermometer was at 0. His company was organized at Petanite Creek, Payson County, Utah County, and consisted of 25 cavalry, 32 infantry, picked men, and 13 men in charge of a piece of artillery. The residue was organized as a permanent camp guard. They crossed 5 ranges of mountains and arrived at Center Creek, 265 miles from Salt Lake City, January 13, 1851. This place had been designated by Elder Parley P. Pratt and a company of explorers as the place in the Little Salt Lake Valley most suitable for a settlement. As soon as the site of the town was determined upon, the settlers commenced working a road into a canyon about 6 miles, which cost them 500 days' work, where they cut down a pole 99 feet long, which they erected and on which they raised the stars and stripes. They dedicated the ground by prayer and saluted the emblem of civil and religious liberty by the firing of cannon. The organization of Iron County had been provided for by the General Assembly of Deseret, which had elected George A. its Chief Justice, with power to proceed with its further organization. An election was held when 2 associate justices, a county recorder, a treasurer, sheriff, assessor, and collector, justice of the peace, constable, and a member of the House of Representatives of the General Assembly of Deseret were elected. In the winter of 1850-51, although it was very cold, the settlers built a fort in which were located dwelling houses and a meeting house, which served for meetings, schools, and watchtower. It was in the shape of a Greek cross and was of hewn logs. It served the town, which was named Parowan, for 15 years, where it was replaced by a stately stone edifice. George A. taught school during the first winter, having 35 pupils, to whom he lectured on English grammar around the evening campfires. At the first territorial election in August 1851, George A. was elected a member of the Council of the Legislative Assembly. He was commissioned by Postmaster General Hall, October 29, 1851, Postmaster of Center Creek, Iron County, and on the 29th of November by Governor Young, Colonel of Cavalry in Iron Military District. There you go. Afterwards, he was placed in command of the militia, the southern part of the territory, and was instructed to take measures for the defense and safety of the inhabitants against the Utah Indians, who had commenced under their chief Walker to rob and kill the inhabitants. In 1852, he left Iron County and was appointed to preside over the affairs of the church in Utah County. He traveled and preached a good deal in all the settlements over which he had watch care. At the General Conference of the Church in April 1854, he was elected historian and general church recorder, and immediately went to work compiling the documentary history of Joseph Smith. February 2, 1855, he was admitted as a member of the bar of the Supreme Court of the Territory of Utah and received his certificate as an attorney, counselor at law, and solicitor in chancery. He He was elected a member of the convention and one of the committee which drafted a constitution, and on March 27, 1856, he was elected by said convention, in connection with Elder John Taylor, a delegate to Congress, to present the Constitution and accompanying memorial, asking for admission into the Union on an equal footing with the original states. This mission was a respite from his close application in the historian's office, where he had, with the assistance of 4 clerks, compiled and recorded in large records the history of Joseph Smith from February 20th, 1843 until his martyrdom in June 1844. He also supplied, from memory and otherwise, blanks in the history and records compiled by President Willard Richards, his predecessor in the historian's office, who had, with prophetic pencil, written on the margin, opposite the blanks, to be supplied by George A. Smith. In 1856-57, during a sojourn of about 11 months in the States, in addition to his duties as delegate, George A. preached in the states of Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. That's quite a list. April 11, 1866, he received from Governor Durkee the commission of Brigadier General and was appointed aide-de-camp to the Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion. Okay. At the October Conference in 1868, he was appointed to succeed the late President Heber C. Kimball as first counselor to President Brigham Young. Oh, I thought it was Willard Richards he replaced. It was Heber C. Kimball. My bad. The political career of President George A. Smith covered almost the whole period of his residence in Utah. He was an earnest worker in establishing the provisional government of the state of Deseret, and afterwards in organizing and enacting laws for the government of the territory of Utah. He was elected a member of the first legislature and re-elected to every succeeding session but one, when absent in the states until 1870. The last 6 years he was president of the council, and was distinguished for his punctuality and impartiality in the discharge of his official duties. More than half of his life was occupied in traveling and preaching the gospel. He had, before 1870, delivered 3,800 discourses in various parts of the world as a labor of love, and never failed to use every opportunity to advocate the principles of the gospel, which his long and laborious missionary experience afforded him. In the internal affairs of the territory, President Smith was an active laborer. He was recognized as the father of the southern settlements, the chief of which, St. George, was named in his honor. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. St. George was named after him. He was president of several irrigating canal companies and was foremost in public enterprises leading to the occupation and development of the country, the establishment of home industries and of commercial relations among the people that would tend to make them free and independent of their communities, and at the same time utilize the natural resources with which the territory abounds. October 15, 1872, he started on a mission and visit to the various European nations and to Jerusalem, whence he returned June 18, 1873. During his absence on this tour, he was appointed and sustained as trustee and trust for the church, which office he held until his death. During his absence on this tour, so 1873. Okay, then we know which year to look at. After his return, he gave considerable attention to the building of the temple at St. George, where he spent a great deal of time. He was a zealous advocate and laborer in the establishment of the United Order among the people. The discourses he delivered in many of the towns of Utah upon that subject were preeminently characteristic of him as a political and domestic economist. In the spring of 1875, about the time of his return from St. George, he was attacked by a severe cold, which, locating on his lungs, inflamed and irritated them in such a manner as to prevent their use in public speaking. This affliction was supplemented with a very peculiar affliction preventing sleep, except in an upright posture, but then at short intervals. He suffered intensely from this combination of diseases for several months, resisting the power of the destroyer with all the fortitude of a strong will and a desire to live, aided by the most sublime faith. He had the support of the prayers of all the people, among whom he was ever a great favorite, but they did not prevail over the decree of him who doeth all things well. Brother George A.'s time had come, was the expression of all his friends, and on Wednesday morning, September 1st, 1875, they bowed to the eternal fiat. President Young remarked on the morning of his death, "I have known Brother George A. Smith for 42 years, have traveled and labored in the ministry with him for many years, and have believed him to be as faithful a boy and man as ever lived, and in my opinion, he had as good a record on this and the other side of the veil as any man. I never knew of his neglecting or overdoing a duty. He was a man of sterling integrity, a cabinet of history, and always true to his friends. President George A. Smith was a wise counselor and a great preacher, a sound statesman, a pioneer and colonizer of the highest ability, an able lawyer and an efficient educator. He was always ready in public and in private. No one ever wearied of his preaching. He was brief and interspersed his doctrinal and historical remarks with anecdotes most appropriate and timely in their application. Short prayers, short blessings, short sermons, full of spirit, was a happy distinction in the ministry of George A. Smith. He was humble and meek, yet full of courage and abounded energy in the cause of right. He always had time to notice young people and children and leave his impress of love and kindness upon the tablets of their hearts. For further particulars, see Contributor, Volume 6, Southern Star, Volume 2, page 345, Historical Record, Volume 5, etc. Okay, I didn't comment as much this time. There weren't a whole lot of surprises. I do remember knowing that he was involved in politics. I believe he did spend some time in Washington, D.C., and he did remark on that. It seems like everywhere he went, he did missionary work. It's like he couldn't stop. So that is kind of impressive, I mean, honestly. Yeah. So let's take a look at the Wikipedia article and see what they missed, if they missed anything. George A. Smith. George Albert Smith, June 26, 1817 to September 1, 1875, was an early leader in the Latter-day Saint movement. He served in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles as a member of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church. Smith was a prominent leader in the settlement of many communities in southern Utah and played a role in the chain of events preceding the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Oh, was he? Really? On September 11, 1857. The city of St. George, Utah may have been named after him. That's interesting. It may have been? Well, I thought it was. Huh. Childhood. George A. Smith was born in Potsdam, St. Lawrence County, New York, the son of John Smith and Clarissa Lyman, and was brought up in the Congregational Church. His first cousin was Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. In September 1832, at age 15, George A. Smith was baptized into the Church of Christ, 8 months after his parents had been baptized. The following year, John Smith and his family moved to Kirtland, Ohio, the church's new headquarters. There, George met his cousin Joseph for the first time. In 1838, he moved with his parents and a large body of church members to the state of Missouri. So far, so good. Everything's exactly as they already mentioned. Church service. In the spring of 1834, the 16-year-old Smith accompanied a group of Latter-day Saints on a 2,000-mile march to Missouri and back to Ohio. This trip, known as Zion's Camp, was intended to bring aid to suffering members of the church in Missouri. Smith served as a missionary to the eastern United States, traveling and preaching during the summers of 1835, 1836, and 1837 while attending school each winter. Smith was ordained to 70 in the priesthood on March 1, 1835 by Joseph Smith. On April 26, 1839, the 21-year-old George A. Smith was ordained an apostle and became a member of the Quorum of the 12. Future church president Wilford Woodruff was ordained an apostle on the same day. The two men replaced former apostles Thomas B. Marsh, who had left the church, and Orson Hyde, who had been disfellowshipped and removed from his position. After Joseph Smith's death, the assumption of the church leadership by Brigham Young, George A. Smith traveled to the Salt Lake Valley as a Mormon pioneer with the first company of settlers in 1847. In the winter of 1850, Smith led a company of volunteers to establish a colony in what is now Iron County. The company consisted of 118 individuals and about 30 families. They settled near Little Salt Lake, today called Parowan Lake. They arrived at Center Creek, 265 miles from Salt Lake City, on January 13, 1851, under direction from the General Assembly of the State of Deseret. The group organized the political entity of Iron County and elected Smith as Chief Justice. During the winter of 1850-51, the settlers constructed a fort enclosing homes, a meeting house, a school, and a watchtower. They named their community Parowan. Smith taught school during the first winter and later served as a member of the Utah Territorial Legislature. In 1868, Smith was called to replace Heber C. Kimball as first counselor in the First Presidency to Church President Young. Smith served in this position until his death in 1875. Smith's first wife, Bathsheba W. Smith, served as general president of the Churches Relief Society from 1901 to 1910. I thought the name rang a bell, and I don't know why I didn't click immediately. I knew that too. I knew it, and I just forgot it. Okay. A son, John Henry Smith, also served as an apostle and member of the First Presidency. George A. Smith's grandson and namesake, George Albert Smith, also became an apostle and later was the church's 8th president. Yeah. So he's quite a legacy, yeah. Smith was the 8th official church historian and general church recorder of the LDS Church from 1854 to 1871. In 1873, he was appointed and sustained as trustee and trust for the church, an office he held until his death. Yeah, as I mentioned. So, Utah War. During the hurried series of actions Young and LDS church leaders initiated on learning of the imminent arrival of the U.S. troops in Utah Territory in 1857 and 58, Smith left Salt Lake City to visit southern Utah communities. Scholars have asserted that Smith's tours, speeches, and personal actions contributed to the fear and tension in these communities and influenced the decision to attack and destroy the Baker-Fancher immigrant train near Mountain Meadows, Utah. Really? Okay, that doesn't sound like he did that on purpose, okay? Leaving on August 3rd, 1857, Smith arrived at Parowan, Utah on August 8th, 1857. And on August 15th, he set off on a tour of the local military district manned by the Utah militia known as the Nauvoo Legion, led by stake president Colonel William H. Dame. Although Smith's rank in the Legion was simply a private, one Parowan resident understood that part of the purpose of his trip was to represent the church leadership and to organize the regiment, inspect the troops, and provide instruction. During the tour, Smith gave military speeches and counseled Mormons that they should prepare to touch fire to their homes and hide themselves in the mountains, and to defend their country to the very last extremity. Smith instructed church members to stockpile grain and not to sell it to immigrants or use it for animal feed. Well, that's one thing. That's different than shooting a group of people. Yeah? In addition to Parowan, Smith's tour included visits to Cedar City and Santa Clara. The group stopped at Mountain Meadows to eat dinner on August 20th with a group of resident missionaries. Smith addressed a group of Indians in Santa Clara, counseling them that the Americans were approaching with a large army, and were a threat to the Indians as well as the Mormons. Riding in a wagon afterwards, John D. Lee said he warned Smith that the Indians would likely attack immigrant trains, and that Mormons were anxious to avenge the blood of the prophets. And according to Lee, Smith seemed pleased and said he had had a long talk with Major Haight on the same subject. Okay. Isaac C. Haight, Cedar City Stake President and second in military command under Dame, met with Smith again on August 21st. Haight told Smith that he had heard reports that 600 troops were already approaching Cedar City from the east, and that if rumors were true, Haight would have to act without waiting for instructions from Salt Lake City. Smith agreed and admired his grit. Well, if he thought an army was coming, I can understand why. Smith later said he was uncomfortable, perhaps on account of my extreme timidity, because some of the militia members were eager that their enemies might come and give them a chance to fight and take vengeance for the cruelties that had been inflicted upon us in the States, such as the Hans Mill massacre, where 18 Mormons were killed in 1838 in a skirmish with the Missouri militia during the Mormon War. Yeah, but these are not the same people. So I don't understand why they would even connect those in their head, because the one in Missouri that was not sanctioned by the government. I guess technically it was because it was by the one Lilburn W. Boggs, the governor, but he was the only one who sanctioned it. The United States federal government did not sanction it. So it's not the same thing. It is not the same thing. This is an army coming from the United States to subdue what they thought was a rebellion, and that was the Utah War. So if George A. Smith thought that they were actually marching right on them, 600 troops, that's scary. Do whatever you have to at that point. I can understand why he would think that immediately, not realizing that these people were fine. They were just immigrants passing through, and they should have been left alone. That's terrible. On the way back to Salt Lake City, Smith was accompanied by a party, including Jacob Hamblin of Santa Clara, a newly appointed Mormon missionary to the natives in the region, who also ran federally funded Indian farm next to Mountain Meadows. Also traveling north with the Smith party were several native chiefs of the southern Utah Territory. On August 25th, 1857, Smith's group camped next to the Fancher-Baker party, headed the opposite direction at Corn Creek, now Kanosh. Smith later said he had no knowledge of the Baker-Fancher party prior to meeting them on the trail. That's probably true. When the Baker-Fancher party inquired about the places to stop for water and grazing, Hamblin directed them to Mountain Meadows, near the Indian farm there, a regular stopover on the Old Spanish Trail. Oh, I'm so sorry. So he basically led them to their death without realizing it. Oh, I do not consider this like a bad thing that he did. We've talked about this in the last few videos, talking about weighing a person in the balance and saying, were they a good person or a bad person, depending on what things they did. I would not consider these actions against anyone. Like, thinking that there were 600 troops on your way and advising people to act without hearing back from Salt Lake. Dude, it took like a week to hear back from Salt Lake. Of course they couldn't wait. Sometimes things have to happen faster than that. And then accidentally directing the people who ended up getting massacred, oh yeah, go that way. Oh, that's so tragic. It's so unfortunate because nobody deserves that, A. And B is that, there's no way he could have known that the other group would react like that. Like, he wasn't thinking that they would react like that. So I'll bet he felt guilty for that forever. That's horrible. Poor guy. Gosh. Poor people. Honestly, it's the people who were slaughtered who really deserve our pity, but this was clearly an accident. There's no way he meant to send them to their deaths. And I feel terrible for everybody involved. Plural marriage. Like many other 19th century Mormon leaders, Smith practiced plural marriage. Well, they listed that really specifically in the last one. Known for his somewhat bombastic speaking style, Smith once said, "We breathe the free air. We have the best-looking men and handsomest women. And if non-Mormons envy us our position, well, they may, for they are a poor, narrow-minded, pinch-backed race of men who chain themselves down to the law of monogamy and live all their days under the dominion of one wife." Dominion. I don't think that most men of the time would have considered themselves under a dominion of a wife. I think most people saw it in the other way around. They ought to be ashamed of such conduct and the still fouler channel which flows from their practices, and it is not to be wondered at that they should envy those who so much better understand the social relations. In addition to his first wife Bathsheba, Smith married Lucy Smith, Nancy Clement, Sarah Ann Libby, Hannah Maria Libby, Zilpha Stark, and Susan E. West. His wives bore him 20 children, 11 of whom were still living when Smith died. Physical characteristics. Smith was a portly man at 5'10", that's 1.78 meters, and at least 250 pounds or 110 kilos. So he's a bit overweight, yeah? He was humorously known for sometimes removing his wig to wipe his brow while preaching. He wore a wig? I had no idea he wore a wig. After seeing Smith remove his hair, glasses, and false teeth, Paiutes gave him the name Non-Choco Wincher, which means takes himself apart. Death. Smith died in Salt Lake City, Utah Territory, and was buried in Salt Lake City Cemetery. They were a bit more specific in the article we read, yeah? So I don't consider him at all responsible for the Mountain Meadows massacre. It feels like he may have been very tangentially involved, and that it wasn't at all his. There definitely wasn't any bad, feelings, but any evil intentions there. So yeah, I would not blame him for that at all. Yeah, I feel like he's one of those very pure people who's a very strong leader. But so far, there's basically nothing negative about him. And considering that we know kind of a lot about his life, that's very impressive. So, he seems like a very ready person. If somebody needs something, I'm here. I'm ready to work. Yeah, put me to work. I'm ready. At all times. And sometimes he'd even take the initiative and do things he wasn't asked to do. Making his trip to Washington, D.C. into a mission trip all over the area. That's very much like him, yeah? He's that kind of a person. He's let's work harder. We are hard workers and we are working harder. And I don't know, that's just kind of the impression I get from him. I do want to briefly talk about the General Conference where he was sustained as trustee and trust. So I'll see if I can find it real quick. All right, I think I found it. This is from October 1870, and I'm just reading the part where, the general authorities are sustained. So, goes Horace S. Eldridge, President of the Perpetual Immigration Fund, to gather the poor, Albert Carrington, historian and general church recorder, and Wilfred Woodruff, his assistant. Elders Lauren Farr of Ogden and William L. Payne of Kaysville were called to go on missions to England. When the motion was put to the conference to sustain President Brigham Young as trustee and trust for the church, he arose and tendered his resignation to that office. At this, the congregation manifested strong signs of disapproval. And when Elder Cannon stated that there were two motions before the conference, one to sustain President Young as trustee and trust, and the other to accept of his resignation of that office, thousands of the people shouted, "No, no!" And when the first motion was put, the vast congregation, agitated by one common feeling, moved and surged for a few moments, and not satisfied with merely holding up the right hand in token of sustaining the motion, great numbers rose to their feet and held up both hands, and a murmur went up from the human sea. Many of the strangers present held up their hands as if impelled by the same spirit that moved the great assembly. The scene was one which will never be forgotten by those who beheld it, and but few persons present could prevent feelings of intense emotion swelling up in their bosoms. There stood the veteran, faithful leader of a people, who had been led by him through the most trying scenes that have proved him to be their best earthly friend as well as spiritual guide, and the people uttering a united protest against his resigning to act for them in that position of trust. President Young tendered his resignation for the office of President of the Perpetual Immigrating Fund and nominated Horace S. Eldridge as his successor to that office. The resignation was accepted and the nomination unanimously sustained. When the motions were put to sustain President George A. Smith as historian and general church recorder and President Daniel H. Wells as superintendent of public works, they resigned those offices. Albert Carrington was nominated to the office of historian and general church recorder, which was carried unanimously. Nominations to the office of superintendent of public works was left over for the present. A vote of confidence and thanks to the first presidency for their labors in the offices they had just resigned was carried unanimously. President Brigham Young gave it as a reason for the first presidency resigning those offices that they would be more free to travel among the people and preach to them. He delivered a very powerful discourse in which he showed that what had produced that wonderful union that exists among the Latter-day Saints. His remarks were reported. So, this is all quotes. I didn't make that up myself. This is 100% things that were quoted by the reporters of the conference. So it was the clerk of the conference who wrote that down. That was in October 1870, and it wasn't until April 1873 when he finally was no longer trustee and trust. All right, so here at the end of the sustainings of April 1873, it says, George A. Smith, trustee and trust for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and John Sharp, Joseph W. Young, John L. Smith, LeGrand Young, Elijah F. Sheets, Joseph F. Smith, Moses Thatcher, John Van Cott, Amos M. Musser, James P. Fries, F. A. Mitchell, Thomas Taylor, and as his assistants. Elder Cannon then said that President Young desired to know whether the conference were willing to release him from the office of trustee and trust. He said he presumed he spoke the feelings of the people when he said he believed they were willing to release him only because he desired it. At a previous conference, President Young made a proposition to be released, and the people were then averse to it. Elder Cannon thought, however, that the people would defer to his desire now, with the understanding that President Young should still retain supervisory power over the trusteeship. Elder Cannon then requested, if that was the mind of the conference, that a show of hands be given, and the vote was unanimous. Truman O. Angel, architect for the church, Albert Carrington, historian and general church recorder, and Wilfred Woodruff, his assistants. That was really interesting to me. I found it really fascinating that that the sustaining of the general authorities had such weight at times. There were times in church history where sustaining the general authorities was really meant something. It really made a difference. And I found that really fascinating. Anyway, I hope that you do too. Since it was related to George A. Smith, I thought that I would read that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed our video today. I really admire George A. Smith as a person, and I sometimes wish I were as energetic as him. But if you like the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.